Welcome. It is no accident that you have found your way to the Release the Genie podcast. What would you do with 3 wishes? And what if you discovered that you are in fact that very genie that could grant them? Well, join us now as we discover who our next genie is as we listen in and learn the stories of triumph, inspiration, and passion with some very special guests. And now, without further delay, your host of the Release the Genie podcast, Mr. Paul Rogers.
That's so much better. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're tuning in from. I am your host, Paul Rogers, and welcome to another episode of Release the Genie. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we even had an echo chamber going on there. So I put that entirely down to my new guest, Michele Rosenthal. And thank you for bringing the extra bit of magic.
You're so welcome. Magic is what it's all about.
Absolutely. Now, I'm going to give you a quick run through intro. So let's see now if you're ready to expand on these few things. So listen to this, guys. Michele and I met, and this is really cool how we met. I actually quoted Michele in one of my posts in Ptsd month. And then Michele got in touch with me and said, hey, thank you for using my quote. And I was like, so rather than thinking I got in trouble, actually, it was really, really cool. And Michele is a wonderful lady. I've had the privilege of being on her podcast, but let me just give you a little rundown for those who haven't met Michele yet. Now, Michele is a trauma recovery specialist. She's a consulting hypnotist, a master NLP practitioner, an award-winning PTSD blogger, an award-nominated trauma author, and we have 3 books, which I will not let her get away without mentioning, and also a wicked salsa and Argentinian tango dancer. So welcome, Michele, and wow, what an entrance.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for creating this space. It is one of my favorite things to do, to talk about raising awareness, trauma, most importantly, healing. So I'm super pleased to be here with you today.
I mean, every time we talk, there's a kind of a bit of a magic. So I figured that it was only fair to show everyone else in the world how awesome our types of conversation are. So I wonder if you could I've set the backdrop for you. I wonder if you could sort of just do a little bit of elaboration for me.
Sure. I think the most important thing is the arc of the story, right, for any of us. And so my story that brought you and I here into this moment is that in 1981, I was just a 13-year-old kid. So if you're doing the math in your head, or you're not good at the math in your head, which I'm not, that means I'm 53 today. I'm just coming up, August 31st will be the 40th anniversary of my trauma. So celebrating that life has continued in all the ways that it beautifully has. But back in 1981, I had a run-of-the-mill infection. A doctor gave me a prescription for an antibiotic without reviewing my chart. And that is an important fact, because if he had, he would have probably prescribed something else. But because he didn't, he gave me a medication that the chart indicated I was most probably allergic to, and in fact I was. And within a week, the medication had turned me into a full body burn victim, inside and out. I ended up in a quarantine burn unit hospital room for weeks on end with an illness that we know now what it is, but in 1981, nobody knew what it was. So I was in this hospital with all of these specialists just watching me burn from the inside out, and nobody knew what to do. Today, they immediately put these kind of patients into a coma until it's over, which I think would be better. but for me, I was awake. I was wholly engaged in the whole process. And so many weeks went by, and by the time I emerged from the hospital, I knew I was going to make a full physical recovery. my parents were amazing, just amazing. And so they recruited all kinds of specialists to help me. And I was in a teaching hospital, so they were willing to try all kinds of things. And so I don't look like a burn victim, which is great. And all of the scarring that I have is mostly internal, and the scarring that was external has faded over the years. So I knew when I got out of the hospital, I was going to make a full physical recovery minus the lingering issues, the scarring that is causing me a problem internally that I still deal with today. But I knew that I would be okay. I was going to have a life. The problem was, and you probably know this, as every trauma survivor knows, you are not the same person coming out of that experience as you were going in. And that was a big problem for me. So I didn't have any help, any guidance. In 1981, PTSD was only a year old as a diagnosis, and that was only being applied to Vietnam veterans. And so no one was looking at a civilian kid with medical trauma and saying, oh, you have insomnia, you have mood swings, you have depression, you have anxiety, you have avoidance, you can't talk about what happened to you. Like, these are some of the classic signs of PTSD, but nobody recognized them. And in fact, it took 24 years for me to get a diagnosis. And so 24 years later, I was just a red hot raging mess. And I just thought I was crazy. And I just had sort of accepted that, there are people who are crazy in this world, and I was going to be as good crazy as I could. But so that's how things began. Obviously, they have a happy ending because my recovery has been fully complete since 2007. So
that is an amazing story. Not only because of the severity, and it's all very well having that condition to live through, but the fear that goes through that of what's going on, and not just for you, because everyone else connected with you as well, because it's very easy to lose sight of everyone else and their collective fear as well.
That's such a good point. Even down to so I know now part of my recovery was researching what had happened to me, because I didn't really know, I didn't understand when it was going on. Nobody did, but I know now that the mortality rate for that is 70+%. So, it was more grave than any of us may have realized.
Wow.
And I had a near-death experience during that whole quarantine burn unit. And my mom is the one who brought me back. So you're absolutely right, because she has carried that for the rest of her life. And my brother, and how it impacted him, and my dad's, my dad, I think, is the best at compartmentalizing everything. But you're right. Your point is so important, because we always look at the person who's survived the most of the brunt of the trauma, but it's the constellation of the family, in this case, or community around them, that also carries the energy of that experience.
And your recovery is remarkable as well. And having an NDE, I mean, there's a lot of research to say that things really you don't come back with the same after that. But I mean, what has been one of your your aha moments in
terms of recovery?
Wherever you want to go on that, we have a full playground.
Oh, that's a good question. Okay. So I think my biggest aha moment was the importance of joy and the power of it, because let's see, so that was 1981. By 1997, the PTSD was just so bad that I finally agreed. I mean, I didn't know it was PTSD at that time. I was just such a raging mess. And I mean, I had addiction, not substance abuse, other types of addiction. I had self-harming practices. I was I couldn't stay in a relationship. I couldn't hold a job. I was constantly I'm from New York, and I was living in New York City at the time, and I would get a job, hold it until the next meltdown, pack up everything, move home to my parents in Westchester, get myself back on my feet, go back to the city, get a new job, a new apartment until the next meltdown, and start the process all over. It was just a disaster over and over. And so finally in 1997, the stress of all of that, I'm sure you've heard this statistic, but I love this. On my own podcast many years ago, I interviewed a slew of scientists, neuroscientists, all this about healing trauma. And one of them said to me that the mind is capable of creating 50% more stress than the body can handle. And my journey really proved that over and over, because the stress in my mind just decimated my body until I had so many medical issues that I eventually agreed to go to therapy, because I didn't think I was going for trauma. I was going to learn how to live as a chronic patient for the rest of my life. And then once I got there, all the trauma came up, right? But so I think in that space of healing, it never would have occurred to me that in order to really reach the full vision that I had for myself as a healed person, it never would have occurred to me that process needed to start with joy. It never would have ever occurred to me, because I felt so dead inside. And it didn't seem to me possible that I could feel anything, much less joy. And when I discovered that on a dance floor, I actually felt good. I felt alive. I felt joyful. At the worst, I was suicidal when I discovered that. So it was like at the worst time, I discovered there was a part of me that could wake up to something better. And holy cow, what an aha moment that was. And I just clung to that, and I danced my way through the rest of my recovery. I'm not kidding. I danced 2 hours a day in a tiny, by that time I had moved to Florida. And so when I decided I needed to dance every day, in my head, I was still thinking, I'm in New York City, I can go to a club every night. And the way I ended up with salsa and Argentine tango was I had moved to a tiny beach town because life had gotten so unmanageable. I needed a small, safe, natural place to try to heal. I got a puppy yesterday. He's a little chatty.
Oh. Welcome to the Release the Genie, Mr. Puppy.
Apologies for releasing the Wheaton Terrier Genie today. So I danced, and now we, like that was back in the early 2000s. But now we know the neuroscience. Joy, when you create the neurotransmitters that go with joy, dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, endorphins, that's like magic for your brain in the healing realm. So that was my biggest aha moment, really, was to realize I can feel better. I'm struggling, but there is a part of me that is still pure enough to connect to something that feels good. And I actually did that twice, speaking of Wheaton Terriers, because dance was the second time. The first time I'd been suicidal, I decided if I was going to live, I needed a dog. And I hightailed it it was my first dog. I got a Wheaton Terrier because I just love this breed. They're hilarious and very snuggly, and I needed something like that. And so that was the first time. So I guess I would say over the whole arc of my entire journey, that the most important takeaway was how important it is to find something that feels good, so that you can connect to that original space in who you are, that I think is buried in every survivor, no matter how bad the PTSD is. I challenge every one of my clients now. You have to find, what are you going to do every day that feels good? Even if it's only for 30 seconds, because it only takes 17 seconds to create a new neural pathway. And I'm an overachiever, so do it for 30 seconds. Then we know it's definitely there. And then every day it repeats and you strengthen it. And that's how the brain learns. So that was a good question.
It's terrific advice. And also, something creative. It may be something which hadn't been one of the big things before, but there's an internal compass, isn't there? And when it hits where it hits, and that's a beautiful challenge you've put down to people. And anyone who is any type of difficulty like that, that's a really good way of just actually breaking through the big thick glass.
It's true. And you can say, if someone had said to me, go find something you love to do, I would have looked at them like they had three heads. So I get it if anybody's feeling like that, because you feel so emotionally dead, so numb. Or I was just working with a client just before we got together, and she was just saying, I'm just completely detached. Like, I cannot connect to anything. And we all do that for so many really good reasons. To be in that numb place makes us able to actually function instead of go completely crazy. I felt on a lot of days. But I think the interesting thing to recognize is that you don't have to, I'm in Florida, so I have clients all around the world, but I have some who are here, and I have one who his joy place is on a wave runner, right? So he just goes out on the ocean for hours on that, which I think is great. But no matter whether you can do something big like that or it's something small, it's, when I started that practice, once I started to think, I just need to feel better for a little while. Sometimes it was just as small as standing in the sun because it just felt good, right? I just started to look for what's a small thing I can do that just feels good, because that at least will be the opposite of how I usually feel. And sometimes that's just being aware of the breeze on your cheek. It doesn't have to be something as big as going for a dance or getting a puppy. It can be the small moments where it's just like, oh, this feels nice, or oh, this tastes good, or this smells delicious. You can start at a small point of joy and then sort of titrate yourself up to the bigger things, just because you're getting into a connection with your brain being able to recognize this is pleasurable.
Yes. And not needing other people's permission, or in fact, even your own permission. It's just like, this is doing it because it feels good, rather than A, B, C, D, E. So I love it. I love it. Well, this is going to be really interesting, given where we are and the the story so far. Is there an inspiring quote or a mantra which you can share with us or live by?
The poet E.E. Cummings has this great line that I love, and it's, it takes courage to grow up and discover who you truly are. And I love that quote, because to me, at the bottom of all trauma recovery are two things, essentially, really. Number one, there's a trauma addiction that has absolutely got to be broken. And number two is an identity crisis that has to be healed. And that's where I love the E.E. Cummings quote, because it does take a lot of courage to grow up and discover who you truly are. And trauma, no matter what age we have it, but for those of us who have it young, especially, trauma at any age stunts you at that age, not just chronologically, but spiritually, metaphysically. You are stunted at the age that occurred, because you get frozen in that space of time if you're struggling with trauma afterward. I mean, there are plenty of people who survive traumas and they go on and they're fine. So, the research suggests that only about 20% of all people who have major trauma end up with PTSD. So even if you want to say that maybe that's a little conservative, the fact is not everybody struggles after trauma. So for those of us who do, I think that, we do get stunted at that age because there are things that are unresolved. And I think it does take a lot of courage to grow up and discover who you are after something massively life-altering. You know that.
Well, indeed, and I was going to say that we are members, exclusive high-ticket paying members of a community, but not only withstanding that actually that has happened, you are now doing and helping other people who are going through something of a similar nature, or just PTSD generally. So to take what you've got and turn that into something you can help people, I think is a massive sign of growing, as you say, growing up and actually taking ownership. So I can see how important that is to going on, not just for you, but for all your people you look after too. Love it.
Thanks. I do feel like if you can stand it, because some people can't, some people don't want to, and I don't even think everybody needs to for a long time, but I think if you can stand it, I think part of the value of moving through these kind of things is that you learn big lessons, really big lessons. And if that can help somebody coming behind you, then I almost feel like it's a moral and ethical obligation to share, because if I can make somebody else's journey, that's been my mission, frankly. Paul, ever since my recovery, I came out of my recovery and I thought, you've got to be kidding me. Because if you had told me this and all that I've learned, I could have healed 3 decades ago. If I had just had the right information, if I'd had the right diagnosis, if I'd had the right criteria, if I had had the right neuroset, like if I had had anything, I could have not lost 3 decades of my life to something that was completely healable.
Yeah.
And so it became my mission to help other people heal faster than I did. And I don't think everybody needs to take on that mission, but I think in everybody's private life, you can see somebody struggling and just share something that you've learned. And I think we do sort of owe it to each other as humans in community to do that.
It's a powerful, powerful gift, and as you say, not everyone is willing to put themselves out to make that. But anyone who does, I know, gets a huge sense of fulfillment back. So. Well, let's now move on to the second part of the show, where I get to ask you as my genie for my 3 wishes. So are you ready?
Wholly and completely.
There we go. That was the right answer. So well done. So far, so good. My first wish is, what is the best advice you've received in your life?
Oh, all right. So best advice that I received in my life came from my parents. So I'm going to give you 2 because we were raised on these tenets. Number 1, my mom always told us, your mind knows only what you tell it. And, as a teenager, I did not appreciate that when she said that. But I mean, now that I've studied so much neuroscience, now I know she wasn't kidding. Like, she didn't know the neuroscience. She just had an idea based on things that she'd read, she'd learned, she'd experienced. I think it's a great piece of advice. Your mind knows only what you tell it. I don't think that I ever had the actual how to that idea. And so my mom would just say, well, you just have to tell your mind what you want it to believe. And I just couldn't make that happen in the dark post-trauma world. It was like my mind seemed stronger than I did. Yep. But the advice that she gave me put me in dialogue with my mind. Yep. It got me trying, at least, to tell it something else. and I know now how powerful that concept is, and I use it all the time. So that was the first piece of advice. And then the second, my dad always told us, action puts fear to flight. Oh. And I have found that such a powerful philosophy whenever I've been frightened, and frankly, during my whole trauma. If there was an action that could be taken, it shifts you out a little bit, not for very long during the trauma, obviously, like what I had, but for other people in different circumstances, this could be the key to not having PTSD. Because when you shift from fear to action mode, you shift from powerless to powerful. Yep. And that's what it's all about. So I would say those 2 pieces of advice: your mind knows only what you tell it, and action puts fear to flight.
Wonderful, wonderful. Hey, I can tell you're a therapist. No, so very, very, so very, very helpful, and across the board that does, people get paralyzed and so brilliant advice. Thank you so much. Wow, that was the first wish. Okay, now I'm going to up the ante. So wish number 2. You ready?
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
I'm calibrating.
Oh yeah.
I'm into 2.
So what advice would you give to your younger self?
Oh, well, of course, when you say that, I have many younger selves. And, but of course, the one that comes to mind is the one I've talked to the most, which is my 13-year-old traumatized self. And oddly enough, whenever I think of her, I think of her right before the trauma happens. I'm sure all trauma survivors have this. You have a picture of you right before the trauma, right? So I have one that was taken about 3 weeks before my trauma. And I look so happy and I look so innocent, and I'm like sitting on a rock by the Pacific Ocean. It's like the world just looks wonderful. And so I would tell her, because she became the traumatized version of myself that I've spoken with a lot. I would tell her, you can do this. And I wouldn't explain it. I would just say, you'll know what I mean when you get to this moment. And just remember, I told you, you can do this. Because I think that's the biggest thing that happens in trauma, is we're so overwhelmed with the smallness of who we are, and the largeness of the moment, that it seems like we can't do anything. And even if it's just making the choice to survive, just making the choice to do whatever it takes, or making the choice to just be in that horror and surrender to it, that's a powerful choice in and of itself.
Very, very powerful, and there's so much to unpack just from that one thing. There's so much really good practical advice that people could, right this second, they could do that right now, and really, really helpful. Thank you so much. So now you've knocked 2 out the park. So let's see if we can go for your hat trick now. This is the third and final wish, which is, could you share one habit that attributes to your success?
Oh, yes. So we've talked about joy, and I literally went on a joy quest. Every day I would wake up and say, what am I going to do today to connect to this sense of joy? And so it started, okay, I'm going to go to this dance class. But then I'll let you in on a little behind the scenes what happened at the dance class. Because it started, I just need to do something that connects me to my mind and my body at the same time, and then gets me out of my mind and just down into my body. Because as you know, we usually have a disconnection here when we're survivors. And so it just started with that. But then, because I couldn't go to a nightclub, what was I going to do? I decided, okay, well, I signed up at a different dance class at a different studio every night of the week. So Mondays I had East Coast Swing, Tuesdays I had salsa, Wednesdays I had West Coast Swing, Thursday I had Argentine Tango. That's how it went the whole week. And once I started to do that, I noticed I started to sleep better. And I had the same recurring nightmare for years, and it started to happen less often. Now I don't have it ever, obviously, but back then it started to happen less often. And I started to just feel myself be a little more hopeful. So joy became a quest. It was like, okay, I'm going to do that every day, which really was every night. And then I started looking at the days and saying, well, what can I do that connects me to joy during the day? And it became this thing. I just every day looked for, where can I feel a sensation of joy? Where can I feel a sensation of joy? So, and that is still a habit that I have today. And the funny behind the scenes story is that my very first Argentine tango class I went to, it was an advanced class, and I'm just sharing this with you because you just don't know where joy is going to take you once you start looking for it. But it was an advanced class. And so I wasn't allowed to join the class because they were doing something that I wasn't ready to do. So the instructor assigned the assistant instructor to work with me just to teach me the basics of the Argentine tango. And that was 2007. And I'm still dancing with him today. Because he started as my instructor, and then he became my dance partner, and then on the dance floor, and then he became my partner off the dance floor. And so, you just don't know how much joy you're going to find when you really start looking for it. I certainly was not looking for a relationship. And this poor guy, I was very upfront. I said to him, look, I'm a mess. Like, we're amazing on the dance floor together, but you do not, like, off the dance floor. This is not pretty. And he was awesome. He stood by me my whole recovery. I mean, he was the one who, when I would wake up screaming from a nightmare, he would just hold me, and he would just put his hand on my forehead, because for some reason that just made me settle, and he didn't mind. So for all the people who have trauma who think, oh, I have to wait to be healed to find love, no, you don't. You just have to find a person who has compassion in their heart and love to give and is willing to share it with you. Because all these years later, the joy that I have in my life now, as a partner, as a just an incredible span of time together, has been amazing. And all because I just decided I was going to dance every day because I needed to connect to a sensation of joy. So that's my favorite habit, because I think Paul, here's the other thing too, which I didn't know then. When you connect to joy, even in the tiniest way, you're raising your vibration, right? You're raising your frequency. And we are frequency and vibrational beings.
Yep.
And so when you raise your frequency, when you raise your vibration out of that dark trauma place, you are opening yourself up to a higher frequency that can bring a very interesting process of healing. So, I mean, we don't have to go into that. That may sound really woo-woo to some people, but the fact is that it is science that we are vibrational beings. And it is, just common sense that when you feel joy, you lift up. Yeah. And when you lift up, you lift out. And lifting up and out of that dark bottom trauma place is an important habit to have.
What? I mean, first of all, it's beautiful. That's a really beautiful story. And secondly, there's a lot of talk of the law of attraction, but I do believe in the vibrational energy. And I know a lot of my friends certainly do. And that when you start to vibrate at a certain energy frequency, you attract the people and things which are also on that vibrational frequency.
Yeah.
And from what I've found and what I look for is it then expands the joy exponentially. It's not 1 + 1, it's 1 whatever. And so that's again, my goodness me, there's some real people. You're going to watch this, have to watch this back. This is really, really good. I'm now going to take you, because I did threaten you that I was going to mention your book. So
okay.
I know. No, first of all, here we go. Right. Okay. Let's do this again. Is there a book you'd like to recommend?
Well, Paul, I'm so glad that you asked.
Excellent. Okay.
Because I do. I've been a writer since I was 7. So way before my trauma, I was a writer anyway. And after my trauma, it was just natural for me to turn to writing. I have an MFA in poetry. My whole educational experience through grade school, high school, college, and grad school was all based on that I wanted to be a writer. Mm-hmm. So even after trauma, that didn't change, which is another conversation in itself. I think it's interesting that who we are originally, you can pull through to your post-trauma self, some aspects of that. So once I got into my recovery process, I hit a real wall and I couldn't get where I wanted to go. And I thought, okay, I think I'm at the point where I have to write about this because I had never written about my trauma. And so I started with poetry because it just was, I could keep it small and more contained. And then I expanded to a memoir, and that was tough, but it really broke through some barriers for me. Writing is powerful. I mean, there's data now about the power of writing in healing trauma. But when I was doing it, I didn't know any of it. I just knew if I can put words to this, I get the power.
Yes.
Not all that stuff in my head.
Yeah. It's a piece of healing for you as well as everyone else. So I completely understand that. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So the first book was my memoir. It's called Before the World Intruded, and it's a story of trauma and healing. And then my second book came out of how important I think identity is in the healing process. And it's Your Life After Trauma, Powerful Practices for Reclaiming Your Identity, because your identity shatters at the point of impact of a trauma. And it splinters into a million pieces. So how do you pull that back together? Well, Your Life After Trauma offers a very clear, simple, not easy, but simple, 3-step process for reclaiming your identity. And sometimes it's reclaiming it because you had an identity and then you had a trauma and you knew what your identity was. But for those of us who are childhood trauma survivors, we didn't have an identity. No. So the book also offers a whole track for if you didn't have an identity, how do you create one now? And so I love that book for that, because it's so close to my heart, that whole process of identity creation. It was something that I've studied since my late teens, because I knew something was wrong with me, but I didn't know what it was.
It's so wonderful because you've channeled the very best parts into actually written word, and now regardless of whatever happens, it's out there. It's actually out there, and it becomes immortal. So that really is a very beautiful way of expressing yourself. So where can we find you after all of this? My goodness me, I can hear that, the people clamoring at the door. So where can we get hold of you? Where do you hang out?
Everywhere. You and I met on LinkedIn. MyTraumaCoach.com. All my books are there. My third book was Heal Your PTSD, and it literally is prescriptive actions for healing post-traumatic stress disorder. So they're all on My Trauma Coach, but they're also on, wherever you buy your books, offline and online. And I'm on Twitter at My Trauma Coach, and Facebook at Michele Rosenthal, and Instagram, sort of everywhere. So that's the world that we live in, right?
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, it's no good hiding that light under a bush. And so therefore being on social media like that just means that there's better exposure for people to find you, which is always, I really believe that people see the things they need to see it at the time they need to see it. So I think that's lovely. Well, let me see if I can sum up here. And I've been following a thread through, and what I really, really enjoy is that there was, first of all, a seed, which was joy, which then was nurtured, and it grew and it grew. And then eventually you were able to actually spend more and more time in it. And as you did that, things started to happen. The tree started to blossom, and a relationship as well. So I think really that is one of the best pieces of advice I think I've heard so far for PTSD and anyone else who's actually going through tough times. It doesn't have to be a PTSD. So if that resonates with you at all, please reach out and get in touch with Michele. You know now where to find her. And I'd like to thank you once again for coming and being a fabulous genie today.
Oh, thank you for letting me be a genie. And if you don't mind, I just want to clarify for anybody who's listened to your beautiful summary or anything that I've said, I just want to make sure joy did not heal my PTSD. But what it did do was help lessen my symptoms and completely expand my courage to do the healing work. because after that, I took off time. I just completely stopped trying to heal. I found dance after I'd gotten my PTSD diagnosis, so I knew what I was up against. And I had just reached a moment where I felt like I had done everything and I was still stuck in that PTSD place. And I just said, I can't do anymore. And for 6 months, all I did was dance. And I didn't try to heal. I didn't do anything. I just danced. And 6 months later, when I was sleeping better and the nightmare had stopped and my mood was improved and I was more functional, then I went back. I had more courage. So I started dancing like February, and in September, or the end of that August, around my trauma anniversary, which always makes me sort of reflective, I decided, okay, I have the courage to go do the rest of what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And I
doing the work, there is no shortcut. There's no sort of, so you're absolutely right to point out that, joy is one of the starting elements, but it doesn't do anything unless you actually are able to do the work as well. So, I totally agree. And thank you for actually just clarifying and making that point, because it's very, very important that people realize that it's not just a pill or anything else that doesn't work. It requires hard work. So, and I know that from listening to you, I certainly, and I know other people will feel very safe in being guided by you. So thank you very much for being a shining light for people who need to get through their struggles. So thank you once again. And we will see Michele around on social media. So now there's no excuse. You now know each other. And stay tuned for another Release the Genie. When we have such fabulous guests like this, there's only one place to find them, and it's here. So thank you very much for watching Release Your Genie. And Michele, thank you once again.
Thank you, Paul.
Well, that's a wrap. You have been listening to yet another episode of the Release the Genie podcast with host Paul Rogers. Be sure to follow Paul on the LinkedIn platform and learn more of Paul's resources at www.takeactionacademy.ca. And until next time, as always, be mindful and be sure to release your genie. Thanks for listening.